Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the Public Safety Beer Regulated Beverages Special Called Meeting to discuss the potential use of license plate readers in the public right-of-way in Nashville and Davidson County. This meeting is also being streamed live on the Metro Nashville network. I'm Councilmember Jennifer Gamble, Chair of the committee. And the purpose of this meeting is to engage the community in the discussion about the proposed use of license plate readers in the public right-of-way and how they may impact public safety and privacy. This is the second of 3 scheduled meetings in a series of community conversations. As you know, there has been a lot of discussion about LPRs recently, particularly as a result of a bill that was introduced by Councilmember Joy Stiles to amend the Metro Code relative to the use of license plate scanners by law enforcement for the purpose of prosecuting reckless drivers and drag racing. Amid that discussion, there have been 2 other bills introduced to expand the use of license plate readers in one way or another, which have further sparked interest in the conversation that we are having today. We have a well-rounded group of subject matter experts that will talk to us about the impact of license plate readers from the legal perspective, as well as it relates to individual rights and liberties. We will start the meeting with a presentation by Dr. Daniel Balasabramanian, who's a research scientist with Vanderbilt University. He will provide information about how LPRs work as far as their operation and data collection. Then we'll hear from our panelists, Brandon Tucker with the ACLU, District Attorney General Glenn Funk, and Chief Public Defender Martisha Johnson. The panelists will speak in that order. Also, those of you watching, please send any questions or comments you may have during the meeting to my email address at jennifer.gamble@nashville.gov. Now we will move into the conversation stage of the meeting, or we will move into the conversation stage and question stage after the speaker presentations. So with that, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Daniel for his presentation.
Thank you. I assume you can see my screen. So this presentation is going to be a little different than the previous 2 I've given. I've talked about our work and our research studies. And today, what I want to do instead is spend most of the time doing 2 things. So the council's had 2 previous meetings with comments, questions, and insights about ALPR from everybody from the chief of police to other legal experts and other law enforcement, the ACLU, and members of the community. So based on those meetings, these slides are going to present 2 things. So first is previous questions and comments from those meetings, specifically the ones held on November 23rd and December 17th of last year. And when possible, I'm going to address those questions and comments with findings from the literature or answers based on what authorities here have stated. And then second, give a brief summary of related literature and previous studies. So I'll just get right into it. So previous questions and comments. There's just a page of these. I summarized these. I took pretty detailed notes. So I'll just go through these one by one. So one question was, what will ALPR be used for? Automated license plate recognition. So specifically, the answer from Chief Drake was Amber Alerts, Silver Alerts, prison escapees, stolen cars, violent crimes, dangerous and most wanted. There were some concerns from some council members that they didn't want this to become package tracking or petty crime prevention. And I think that spoke to that point. What is the expected outcome? Overall improved neighborhood safety and help in solving the aforementioned types of crimes. Where would ALPR cameras be placed, and specifically, how would the placement be equitable, particularly with respect to historically disenfranchised neighborhoods and communities? And the answer there was, initially at least, where people want them. So for 2 examples were cited. Those included Haynes Park neighborhood and Antioch. Who will have access to this data? That'll be determined by the proposed legislation, but in a nutshell, it'll be relatively restricted. Only specific people will have access. Who will data be shared with? Most of the current proposed legislation forbids this sharing across agencies without legislative warrants. However, past literature that I'll get into in just a little bit, and community surveys. So past community surveys from roughly 8 to 10 years ago found community support for sharing data. So just bringing that out, and I'll get into that later. How will we survey people who are opposed to this? So one person asks, how can we talk to people who are on the other side of this, who don't want it? Literature suggests that random sample surveys are a good solution. So not samples specifically for people who want it or don't want it, but random sample surveys of communities. Question was, is information shared with other agencies and other jurisdictions or ICE? Not without warrants under proposed legislation. But again, previous community surveys found support for some sharing. There's a question about specific instances where people were tracked or people broke into the system and tracked people. During my literature reviews, I found one example. It's in my notes, which you can't see on the screen. I'll shrink this. And that was in 2012, the Minneapolis Star Tribune published a map displaying the location of the mayor's car that had been recorded. But that was accessed via a public records request and not via a break-in or breach of the system. So the answer is, in my literature reviews, I did not find evidence of that. That's not to say it hasn't happened. Previous comments. So those were the questions, some of the questions that have been asked. And here's some of the comments. I'll just take these in no particular order. So one was, the public should be made aware of all possible uses of this technology, and this should be made into a bigger public issue. And there, random sample surveys may help. The literature backs this up in previous studies. Specifically, I'll get into it later, but one done in Fairfax County, Virginia, of about 400 to 500 people, residents. One person noted, or they were concerned that this could be used to build a case against an individual unfairly. From literature and community meetings and what we're hearing, ALPR evidence is most often used as a jumping off point to start solving a crime. There's another comment later on that speaks to this as well. Another comment that we heard was, when things go wrong, they too often target Black and brown minorities. And this is an observation that's been made in the literature. It's important to have policies, legislations, and safeguards in place to prevent this, to guard against this. In that literature, I've got it all cited at the end, but if you want to know what it is right now, it's called The Judicial Response to Mass Police Surveillance. It's from 2011 by Stephen Russian. Another person said they see this as a debate about how we want to reimagine public safety. And indeed, ALPR is one kind of technology that's changing the courts, legislature, and public perceptions about how to balance technology and privacy. So indeed, this is a conversation and part of a bigger picture, I think. More questions. So there was a note, some people were concerned, they said the assertion was ALPR can and will be used to track movements. So ALPR is a technology that can enable tracking. Whether it will is a different matter. And the goal here, and the goal in the literature that I've surveyed, is to put in place policies, legislation, and technological safeguards to try to guard against abuses of the system. These discussions are about putting a policy in place, was an observation by someone else, and it seems like that is the case. That's true. Literature says, literature supports this, says the law is not very clear on this. It hasn't really caught up to technological advances, particularly in tracking and surveillance, but it supports putting a policy in place, and it supports the idea that there's no one-size-fits-all policy that works for everyone. So it's certainly doing a reasonable and right thing according to the literature, debating this and coming up with a policy that suits current needs and interests. Someone else wanted to go to the community before the system is in place. Community surveys may yield more trust and better feedback from the community. So these forums are important. Surveys are important to do on a regular basis, not just for this, but it would help with this as well, to build trust and understanding. Another council member noted, we've heard two fundamentally different viewpoints of public safety. You can see it as those in favor and those against it. And this probably isn't surprising to a lot of people. It's in line with previous findings. So, for instance, I take this as a quote from a document I'll show later. Populations are often split, for example, between those willing to give up civil rights to combat terrorism, those who disagreed with such a notion. The complexity in beliefs regarding civil liberties, privacy rights, and public security was also discovered in varying levels of support for different uses of LPR. So, in other words, how you line up there with that previous thing dictates and predicts how you'll line up and view LPR. But not all uses of LPR are viewed equally, as we'll see. Another comment was LPR provides a bias-free view of a crime, and in this person's 15 years of experience, they had never seen a license plate misused, and there was an open question whether anyone knew of instances where a license plate had been misused. I did not find evidence in the literature. That does not mean it has not happened. That's just an open question. Our ALPR should be subject to clear guidelines was another concern. And that's what this is attempting to do. All the proposed pieces of legislation, there's a very detailed one, I believe by Ms. Johnston, that's being considered, that attempts to define very clear guidelines that are in accordance with deep literature and law guidelines. Others have stressed the importance of community engagement around the use of cameras. Again, public hearings are useful like these. Surveys can also offer a good form of engagement and foster trust. Just a couple more comments and then I'll get into the literature. Someone from the ACLU said, privacy concerns arise when data is collected at scale. This is true. And this has been noted during judicial proceedings, even among the Supreme Court. Professor Christopher Slobogan, who's on this project, View Law School professor, he's an expert on this. Specifically something called the mosaic theory of Fourth Amendment law. He's written extensively about it, and he's involved in, to some degree, with various council members. Some court opinions have stated that limiting the amount of time that data is retained is one potential solution, although the issue is far from settled. And he could give a very detailed and thorough review of that if and when people are interested. Another person said, I think we'll regret expanding the use of ALPR because we'll hurt instead of help the people who most need help. And I didn't find evidence of this in literature reviews. However, there is an opinion that courts are better positioned than the legislature to regulate police technologies. And that's one opinion. Okay, so there are differing viewpoints. And again, that document is, again, the judicial response to mass police surveillance, a document. These are all, for the most part, these are readily available. And I'll show you where you can find them with links in these slides at the end. But again, I didn't find evidence of this. There are opinions and there are statements on unfairly targeting minorities, which is the case in opinions of some things. So those are, at a broad level, the questions and concerns and comments that have come up during the past two council meetings on this. So what I did was try to address those from the literature point of view. And now I just want to run down the literature that I reviewed to come up with those. So there are about 7-8 papers here, and links to all of these are listed, and I'll distribute these. I'll get these out to anyone who's interested. License plate readers, community perspective, community support for LPR, automatic license plate recognition, an exciting new law enforcement tool with potentially scary consequences. And I've got kind of a summary of a few of these after this. I know my time is not unlimited here, so I'll get to it. This may be one of the most relevant, license plate readers, a community perspective. So this is just a 2-page summary of a study that was done. So findings include recommendations based on a survey of 2,000 Fairfax County, Virginia residents. And I think this was a decade ago, but the paper will be definitive on that. So finding 1 was police agencies should make it a regular practice to conduct random sample surveys of communities to get a better measurement and gauge of attitudes. So that's the basis for saying that surveys would likely and could inform and help inform policies and opinions. Number two was one size does not fit all. Okay, so that was a finding from this study. And so that's in line with what we're doing here, studying this from multiple angles and developing a custom policy. Surprisingly, I found out many citizens had not heard of LPR before the survey, and they didn't know whether the local police used it. Three suggestions were made to alleviate concerns about it. So one was obtain some kind of permission to use the collected data. Two was consult with an attorney about its use. And three, provide at least some forum for public to discuss the issue. So we're doing three right now. There are attorneys involved in this, kind of independent third-party entities who are helping draft legislation that's based on best practices from the literature. Number four, important points note that support for LPR, the scanning, storage, and use varies across crime types and investigations. So in a nutshell, what they found was people were more supportive for specific cases and higher profile crimes rather than broad cases where it was unclear how long data was going to be retained and what it was going to be used for. The example they gave was people were more supportive if it was used for matching hot lists and finding stolen cars and violent felons rather than finding someone who was late on their child support. And that's probably not surprising, but it's comforting to know that studies and literature backs those intuitions up. And five, most people said police should be able to share LPR data with other government agencies. So that goes a little bit counter to the policies that we put in place so far. And I'm just speaking strictly as a third party, saying previous studies have found that. So maybe it's something to revisit. And again, no sharing without a warrant currently. Community support for LPR, main findings, substantial support for many uses, although public also appears to know little about the technology. Uses are not regarded equally. Decreased support for LPR. So this is the important one from this paper. A number of factors decrease support for LPR. So number one is the extent to which a use involves purposes unrelated to vehicle enforcement. Two was the extent to which a function involves prolonged storage. So the longer you store it, the less likely people are to support it. And three, the extent to which use is perceived as impacting average members of the community. So the more that people feel like it'll impact average people rather than just outlier, dangerous, and wanted fugitives, and cases like that, that decreases support. Just a couple more to run down here before my time's out. An exciting new law enforcement tool with potentially scary consequences. So the literature wasn't all entirely pro. It's important to do a proper literature survey where you take both sides. Main findings, it's important to consider the privacy implications of ALPR, and you need proper checks and balances. And I think it's fair to say that these council meetings and the proposed policies that have been laid out attempt to do this. Another one, I'll just give the in other words here, the simple version of this. The Fourth Amendment, study of the Fourth Amendment law is not caught up to technological progress. So there's so much tracking and camera and technology these days that laws have not really caught up to it yet. Technology is far ahead of the law. Professor Chris Slobogan, who's on our project, View Law School, is an expert on this, and again, it's going to inform some of this discussion and some of the proposed ordinances. So in summary to this, we can benefit from community surveys. They've been shown to foster trust and understanding. Clear guidelines, policies, and legislation are important. We're taking these steps. We're in the process of developing our own surveys, and I think when we get those, we get a broad enough survey out and with enough responses, it can help inform this. Happy to take any questions or comments. I should note there's one other document. It was a report from the ACLU. I think it's about 4 or 5 years old. It's called "You Are Being Tracked," and at the end they lay out a series of recommendations and guidelines. Sorry, I didn't include it in this literature survey. I'll amend these slides to include that. But those guidelines that they lay out, such as limiting the amount of time that data is retained and limiting it only to specific uses, are things that are being put forth in the proposed legislation and rules. So with that, I'm happy to take questions or comments or turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you. We will reserve questions for the end. I appreciate your presentation. I do want to note that I think in your research you cited that there weren't any, I guess, cases where the license plate readers were misused or misinformation led to incidents of discrimination. And I know recently, well, at least last year, there was an issue in Colorado where a Black mother and her young children were stopped, searched, and seized based on misinformation from a license plate reader. So there are incidents that have occurred, but we are, wanting to see if there are or look at policies and procedures, safeguards that will attempt to reduce the risk of that kind of thing happening if we were to use this tool to help solve crimes and address issues in our city. With that, so thank you. Thank you very much. With that, we will take questions in a little bit here. First, we'll hear from Brandon Tucker with the ACLU. Brandon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate what the previous speaker has alluded to, and I appreciate the correction on mistaken use of the tool and when the tool is incorrect. I was going to quickly cite that in San Francisco, a woman named Denise Green was pulled over, held at gunpoint for 20 minutes, handcuffed, all because of a bad tip from an ALPR reader. And it turns out that the plate misread a number saying a 7 where there was actually a 3. And if that doesn't meet the standard of misuse and we just call that a mistake, we've also acknowledged and know that the AP Associated Press some time back through records requests to state agencies and city departments found law enforcement officers and employees who misused databases were fired, suspended, or resigned more than 325 times between 2013 and 2015 and received reprimands, counseling, or lesser discipline in more than 250 instances. And I believe that can be categorized as misuse of a database associated with a tool or technology. But to get to the heart of the ACLU stance and position around the tool of license plate readers, our primary concern is that it will be used to gather data indiscriminately on an entire population so as to enable the government to track their location, including populations who have committed low-level crimes, people with misdemeanor warrants, including people who have committed no crime at all. That is what makes this technology apt for abuse and also apt for over-policing certain communities. And when I say certain communities, I mean communities that have been historically over-policed, being communities of color. And there are two ways to stop, or a couple of ways to stop that from happening. And the first is to limit data retention. And if you have a year's worth of data, if your policy is to wipe clean your acquisition or your data associated with license plate readers after 6 months or a year, then you have 6 months or a year to piece together a person's movements in a local jurisdiction. Obviously, if you have 30 days worth of data, then that is moving in a more acceptable, better direction. And to speak to a new amendment that I've read, if you have a few minutes worth of where that data can be retained, you're moving into an even better space. And the second way to stop mass surveillance, to limit the scenarios of which the tool can be utilized. And so if license plate readers can be used on anyone in the name of stopping crime, then the technology will not be constrained. However, the ACLU believes, and we've been consistent, that there are legitimate purposes for using this technology. And the prime example is an Amber Alert or a missing person where, and their whereabouts are associated with the vehicle, and an LPR registers a match on that plate. We view that as complete legitimate use, a proper function of law enforcement, things like toll collection and emission standards. But what we see is the potential use growing by the moment. And so moving from just Amber Alerts to crimes associated or to uses associated with warrants, not distinguishing between misdemeanor and felony warrants, uses associated with any crime, uses associated with proximity of a crime. These are when the tool can be utilized in a fashion that gives law enforcement leeway to abuse the tool. And so, again, one of the ways to limit the potential likelihood of mass surveillance and abuse is to limit the scenarios in which the tool can be utilized. And layered over these concerns is our commitment to ensuring racial equity in policing. And, this is a problem with all surveillance technology. If used in a discriminatory fashion to over-police Black and brown people, that is a very serious concern that I believe that this body and the community need to speak to in a very real fashion. And so, just to get to the where we are in this conversation and how we've gotten to a place where trying to limit drag racing or trying to limit other offenses, ALPRs or license plate readers have the capacity to read thousands of plates per minute. This might be useful data when trying to catch a suspected car thief or in use of an Amber Alert. But our counterparts in Maryland found that only 47 of every 1 million plates read, or 0.005%, were linked to a stolen car or a serious crime. So still, we tend to lean toward what's happening with the other 999,953 records. Is that being purged within minutes, or is that residing in law enforcement's database for 30 days, 60 days, however long? And so, in other words, if there are not strict or precise restrictions on the data retention, then you have the likelihood of treating all vehicles that have been captured by this tool as prospective suspects at one point in time in the future. And so to wrap up and to summarize, the bills that we have been seeing, the amendments that we've reviewed, we are keeping in mind the policies that govern the tool, the data retention associated with the tool, and the ability to prevent abuse of the tool. And one of the ordinances that we spoke to recently, we took a neutral position because we cannot get to a space of support for expanded use of the tool. And so when we're trying to utilize for any criminal offense, low-level petty misdemeanor, all the way up to the more serious crimes, which we understand the argument for, that's when we get into a space and suspect and fear the possibility of over-policing, the possibility of discriminatory usage, and the possibility of discriminatory placement of the tool. And in reviewing a recent amendment filed, I think it gets us closer to a policy or an ordinance that we can get to a place of support. It requires data deletion within minutes, which also alleviates concerns about who has access to that data, and those hot lists that need to be maintained according to a limited use. It also requires quarterly reporting, and we would like to see the uses cases constrained even more. But our opinion is only one opinion, and there are more voices that matter in this conversation. And so there needs to be continued community input, outreach, keeping in mind civil liberties, keeping in mind individuals' privacy and liberty, and keeping in mind the racial justice and racial equity implications of utilizing such a tool in a space of surveillance that has been disproportionately impacted amongst communities of color. And so those are the important aspects I think we need to continue to keep in mind when trying to respond to a growing trend, whether it be drag racing or whether it be car thefts. These are the important implications and important conversations that I believe we all need to be having to identify if a tool is appropriate for Metro Nashville. And with that, I'll be happy for questions later on, but I appreciate the time, Chairman.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Thank you for the information you shared. Thank you for being a part of this discussion process from the very beginning. And as we continue, we appreciate you bringing the perspective from the civil liberties and privacy point of view. And we will have questions for you after we finish the presentations. And with that, General Funk, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for adding to this discussion regarding the legal impact of LPRs and how it may help as a tool in solving crimes in our community. You're muted. We can't hear you. Okay, there you go.
How about that? All right.
Yes.
Appreciate your inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. And first of all, I want to validate the concerns of people who are concerned with privacy issues, and especially the folks that might be concerned about how they could imagine potential abuses in Nashville by the criminal justice system. I can tell you this, that since taking office in 2014, I've been extremely conscious of the fact that there are some parts of our community that have felt over-policed, over-prosecuted, over-incarcerated. I've been working really hard on criminal justice reform since my first day in office, since years before anybody even became conscious of the term criminal justice reform. That had been a term in 2014. I'm sure I would have used it in my campaign. But we've been doing some things to really try to focus prosecution on violent crime and trying to make sure that the community is safe and making sure that people don't suffer the consequences of an arrest or a conviction, and especially not of incarceration, unless it's a very serious matter that we need some sort of incapacitation or a very specific deterrence for that type of very serious prosecution. And I could certainly understand how license plate readers could cause folks to have a concern for potential abuse. I could imagine people thinking, well, if there's a license plate reader and the police department knows somebody's got a revoked driver's license, then maybe they're just going to go and arrest poor folks for driving on a revoked license because they know they had a revoked driver's license and the license plate reader caught it. Except for in Nashville, we instead of convicting and incarcerating people for driving on a revoked license, we send them through the Steering Clear program and help them get their driver's license. And our incarceration rate for driving on a revoked license, which was at 18,000 inmate days in jail back in 2013, is now less than 100. And those are only for folks that are driving while they're on probation for DUI. And we've got an over 25% conversion rate of getting people their driver's licenses back even after they've gotten a citation. And so the potential for the police department using this technology to try to tackle that issue is zero, because the cost benefit of that would be nothing, right? It would cost more than any benefit that we would be getting. My concern as district attorney and why I'm in favor of license plate readers is twofold. First of all, we do not have a 100% solve rate on murders. We do not have a 100% solve rate from our police department on aggravated robbery. Chief Drake is doing some things with some reorganizations that I expect to have reap some benefits. I've assigned certain assistant district attorneys to work as liaisons to those new divisions centralized divisions that he's put together. And I expect the solve rate to go up. But even then, we need to use every advantage that we have, every technological improvement that we have to be able to discover, track, find perpetrators of violent crime. We've got a case going where someone who had committed a murder out toward Ashland City, surveillance had captured the license plate, and it was not a license plate reader, but surveillance had done that. And as they were driving through the Metro Nashville airport, that car and that plate got picked up, and we were able to ultimately not only identify the person, but be able to track where they had been and be able to tie them to the murder. We've got another case where, once again, it wasn't a license plate reader, but surveillance of a shooting that took place at night of someone who is involved in the Metro Public Schools was the victim. Because that surveillance video captured the license plate number, it was just a temporary track tag, but we were still able to capture it. The police department was able to use that to discover who had that car, talk to the family member who had recently purchased the car, find out who had the car, then piece together a case and successfully make an arrest in that case. This is important technology, and front end of this, as the district attorney, I want police officers being able to make arrests for the cases that have happened that are the serious violent crimes, and I want to make sure they're arresting the right people. That's important, but many times this doesn't open and shut the case, but it's a starting point of the investigation, and it helps narrow the field of places where they, instead of going out and knowing that 1 out of 800,000 people might have done this murder, they can actually narrow the field down to something that is a much smaller population, help focus their efforts in a productive way. And if they are then looking for someone, then hopefully they can find that car or that individual more quickly if you've got license plate readers in high traffic areas. Just a few weeks ago, we had a nurse murdered on Interstate 440. I think if we'd have had license plate readers out there, we could have identified the person and apprehended the person much quicker. We were very fortunate. We've made an arrest in that case. So I can't talk about that case too much since it's a pending case, but we would have liked to have solved that crime within minutes instead of, in a week. And we're fortunate that the community came together and helped us solve that crime. That's on the front end. On the back end, as the district attorney, jurors are properly skeptical when a district attorney brings a case and asks them to convict, and they want to know beyond a reasonable doubt. With the lawyer and police officer shows, on television, they're used to seeing this high tech, and they want us to provide evidence that is similar to what they've seen on television. Conversely, because of the growing skepticism based on some true life documentaries where there may have been some wrongful convictions, I think the standard the jurors are expecting before they're willing to sign off on convicting someone of a serious crime is higher now than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago for sure, but even 5 years ago. And we welcome that challenge. We have an awesome power, and before we do that type of punishment, we want to make sure that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt to where every juror is comfortable in their certainty of guilt before they bring a conviction. And when we bring information, when we are able to bring license plate reader information, that is another piece of evidence that a jury can look at and say, well, yeah, here's the license plate reader information. That makes sense. That corroborates what this witness has said. Nobody wants to send someone to prison because of uncorroborated witness testimony. But when we get the license plate reader information, when we can then take that and get some surveillance camera angles from somewhere else, when we can then match that with some other forensic analysis, that's how we're going to be building the case as we head into this next decade in a way where we can truly and effectively and efficiently be able to make sure that the people that are really willing to make and commit violent crimes, who are out there doing acts that make us all less safe, we need to be able to incapacitate those folks with trials and convictions and the certainty that we can be able to put the right people in front of judges and juries. And then on the cases where somebody needs to face incarceration, we make sure we've got the right ones. We don't want to convict any innocent people, but we also want to make sure that folks that are guilty are held accountable. And this will help us do that. It's an important technology. I agree with Mr. Tucker's assessment that we don't want this used to help lead to some type of mass incarceration for minor charges. On the other hand, making sure that people are held accountable under the law, especially for the most violent crimes, this is an important piece of technology for us.
Thank you. And thank you for explaining to us kind of how the use of the scanners will be helpful and used in the investigations and prosecutions that you'll have to deal with. One thing that I guess I heard that is maybe kind of different from what we're talking about is the surveillance piece with the license plate readers. From my understanding, we're not necessarily looking for surveillance, but more so snapshots of license plates that go into a database. And if a crime is committed and there is a record of a car or a license plate that was used in that crime, then law enforcement could go back into the database and see where that vehicle may have been in relation to that crime. But that is done after the crime has been committed. It's not a case where people are being surveilled and then identified as crimes or issues as they're happening, but it would be after the fact. So we'll talk a little bit more about that after our next presenter, but thank you so much for giving us that perspective. And now we'll have our Chief Public Defender, Martisha Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you again for the opportunity to continue to participate in this discussion. I really appreciate the listening to myself and others from a previous meeting where we asked for the opportunity to continue this discussion in a public forum. And so I really appreciate the council and you, Chair Gamble, for the opportunity for that. I actually have some support for both my colleagues, Brandon and General Funk, for the things that they have said. And so I will try my best to not repeat information that has already been provided. And I will centralize my comments in 4 areas related to policy, privacy, potential for misuse, and then community building or continued community fracturing. I'm concerned as I start my thought process here that we are talking about the word surveillance. And I know when we are talking about license plate readers, we're not talking about active live filming or active live surveillance, but this type of technology tool is a tool for surveilling the public. And talking about surveillance as a method to improve neighborhood safety is one that I have to question whether there is a proportional benefit to the risk. And as I have thought through this many, many times now, I keep returning to that answer for me being no. I think license plate readers are certainly a tool that are utilized by law enforcement and can be helpful as a tool for law enforcement. I think that tool, though, is subjected to a cost-benefit analysis that we have to continue to be invested in. And I don't just mean fiscal costs. I'm talking about the cost to our city. This form of surveillance subjects every single person who drives in this city to the possibility that their license plate will be scanned, monitored, utilized, and then their privacy impacted. So this affects us all. It does not just affect people who have been suspected of criminal activity. And because of that, on the front end of this, we have to talk about the policy that goes into how we will implement license plate readers if we decide that is an investment that this city wants to make. And I'll talk about the investment piece a little later. The things that concern me are related to access. who has the ability to utilize the information that will be snapshotted from the license plate readers? How long will that information exist? We know that if it is an indefinite period of time, then that creates continued privacy concerns. It also creates continued distrust amongst members of the community whose information will be existing in these databases. How is this information being shared? Is it going to be shared across the regions to other departments, to other places? Is it going to be subjected to the potential for creations of hot lists? Who makes it into that hot list and other tracking devices? Police continue to have many, many tools at their disposal, and certainly this can be one, but we can't wait until after the fact to decide what the real life policy implications will be. And in my considerations for other things that we have brought into the city, primarily body cameras, when we've gone through that over and over, we've talked about policy, but often talked about policy after we have implemented the technology. And so I am really, really, really concerned that before we make endeavors to expand something that causes such great privacy concern, we have to do the work to create the policies that are strictly written on the front end and that they will address all of the things that create such a potential for distrust and potential for misuse. I was going to mention both the Aurora episode and the episode in San Francisco in my remarks, so I won't repeat them, but I will say this. We can't wait in the aftermath for an incident like that, where people have been pulled from their vehicles, where people have been held at gunpoint because of misinformation, or just, as we all know, technology comes with problems. It's not a foolproof system. It's not a perfect system. But we cannot wait until the aftermath of that, until somebody's life has been upended, turned upside down, so they have gone to prison or been subjected to the barrel of a handgun before we realize that there is potential for hacking, there is potential for misuse, and there is potential for real danger to people if we don't do this in a method, in a way that protects the community. And finally, I want to centralize my comments to our Nashville community. What we have repeatedly heard in my many years of living in this city, but most recently as we have continued to talk about policing and fracturing police relationships in the city, is we have heard from our community that they want a better relationship with the police, that they want more resources allocated for affordability in neighborhoods and education, that they want pushes for initiatives that continue to divert people out of the system, that are supportive for reentry practices and restorative practices and criminal justice reform and reimagining how we do public safety in this city. So to respond to those repeated requests with more privacy infringements creates deeper fractures, has deeper effects and pain for the community members that I often serve. It creates more opportunities for poor, Black, and other minority communities to continue to feel over-policed, to continue to feel like their privacy in this city does not matter. Because what we know is the more that we create opportunities for surveillance and privacy, the more we create opportunities for disparate impacts, the more we create opportunities for disparate enforcement, the more we create opportunities for bias in our practices over policing, and the more we will have parts of this community who do not feel like they can be heard by law enforcement or the people who make rules and governances around this city. And so I believe that when we do a real cost-benefit analysis here, we could utilize these resources to make for a better relationship with our police and our communities, and not create more opportunities to infringe on the privacy of all of us, when what we have heard is that the tool is a benefit, but that benefit most oftentimes is a very small microcosm that goes into a bigger investigative pocket when doing an investigation around crime. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your perspective and really hitting home the consequences of making policy without having proper protocols and procedures in place. I'm hopeful that these community discussions will give an opportunity for the public to be involved in this discussion, to provide input, as to how, or if we use this technology, how it can be used in a way that it benefits the community and law enforcement. And I just appreciate all of you all joining here today. So with that, we will move into the conversation and question part of the meeting. We'll try to keep this to about 30 minutes, this section, and I will start. I've been watching the hands. I will start with Council Member Sepulveda and then Council Member Rosenberg. Councilwoman Sepulveda. Okay. We'll go to Councilman Rosenberg. We'll come back to you, Councilmember Sepulveda. We can't hear you if you're trying to speak. And that's my mom in the background.
Flashed unmuted for just a quick second there, and then.
Okay, we'll come back because we'll go on, Councilman Rosenberg.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for putting this together. This has been really, a really interesting panel. I'd like to expound on a couple things. LPRs, of course, have the capability to photograph the back of your car. Optionally, its occupants, depending on the system, your license plate, the time, and where it is. And what has not really been part of this discussion is that, per our council attorney, all of this becomes public record. This means that this data is available to anyone, any Tennessee resident to obtain, including would-be stalkers, harassers, other criminals, and people who just want to sell the information. That data can then be used to target individuals, to understand traffic patterns around certain targeted locations at certain times, or surmise when particular homes are likely to be vacant and vulnerable. The discussion about what occurred in Aurora and San Francisco, those are not aberrations. The Vallejo, California Police Department did a study of its own fixed LPRs, and they found that 37% of their hits were misreads. More than 1 in 3 of them were mistakes that had the potential to lead for abuses. There are positive stories, of course, but we need to acknowledge the bad ones, and there are a lot of them. In Virginia, law enforcement used LPRs to track who attended political rallies of both parties leading up to the 2008 election, as well as who attended the presidential inauguration that year and retained that data. In another case, an LPR company who actually is pursuing Nashville's business contracted with ICE to share the data captured by its LPR network so they could target immigrants. But such a contract wouldn't really even be necessary if you can obtain the data under public records, the open records laws. Police in New York used LPRs to surveil Muslim communities. They targeted mosque parking lots and nearby streets. Police often use LPRs to target their list of suspected gang members, and those are lists that are notoriously unreliable. They often rely on vague or contradictory criteria. And Chicago's Inspector General found that this raised serious concerns about officers, quote, how officers perceive and treat the people with whom they interact. That's a quote from their report. You have more specific abuses. There was a police lieutenant in Washington who used LPR reader data to blackmail patrons of a bar frequented by members of the LGBT community. And as Mr. Tucker noted, the AP found countless instances of police abuse of databases where safeguards and policies were ignored to track love interests and journalists. The U.S. Department of Justice published a study that found, quote, significantly lower levels of trust in police, as Ms. Johnson indicated, among subjects once they became aware of LPR use. On the other side, if you're hoping to catch someone who's on your bad guy list, you're going to need to have an officer very nearby to respond quickly before you lose that subject. And I don't know about everyone else's part of town, but it's pretty rare that there's a cruiser right nearby at any one moment. This also incentivizes criminals to do their crimes in new ways. If the arteries are lined with LPRs, you take neighborhood streets instead. If you're worried about a plate being on the hot list, you might need to steal plates more frequently to stay ahead of it. And there are plate covers and sprays that obscure plates from LPRs that are commercially available and cheap, and some news stations find are pretty available. So I really feel like the benefits are being oversold and the dangers, but specifically communities that that are already facing systemic dangers are being ignored. So I hope folks will consider the substitute that I filed last meeting and would like to continue working on, that takes a very careful step. Mobile readers are already legal. This would allow those and allow no data retention, just immediate matches to match to the bad guy list. It would require visual confirmation of the supposed match. It would allow the DA or the public defender to investigate misuse and request that the council suspend use. And it would require quarterly reporting so that we can evaluate how it's being used and what the benefits and drawbacks are. It's a really serious issue with significant impacts. And I hope that we can continue to have these conversations and then tread carefully. So thank you again, Madam Chair, for putting these together and for everybody who's participating tonight in a really important conversation.
Thank you, Councilman. And also I'd like to thank the sponsors of those two bills, Councilman, I'm sorry, it's Councilwoman Johnston, and I was trying to remember, and O'Connell, Councilman O'Connell, for deferring that legislation until we are able to have more community discussions, more input from the community regarding the proposed use of LPR. So as you mentioned, the substitute that you presented, that those things won't be considered by the council until at least the first meeting in February. So we will continue to have these community discussions. There's another meeting already scheduled for January 12th, and I'll talk about that at the end. But with that, we'll go to Councilwoman Sepulveda. Are you able to come in now? Okay, great.
I apologize.
You have the floor. No problem. You have the floor.
Thank you. And thank you for having these community meetings. This is the first one I am actually able to attend, so I apologize if I'm repeating some things that have been stated before by other council members. And this issue is very important to me. And so I'm gonna be quite honest with you all. I am not in favor of expanding the powers of LPRs. I'm not in favor of, even if a legislation comes up where data is only kept for a certain amount of time, I'm not in favor of any of that, because this is life and death for many of us, for many people who look like me and who look like my colleagues and who look like my family, right? One of the big issues, and it's not the only issue that I have with this, is the ICE component of it. Even if we write into future legislation that we aren't gonna allow the company we're doing business with sign a contract with ICE to share data, that does not mean that ICE cannot request a warrant for one. And many of us have people who live in our districts that are undocumented, and just because they are undocumented and don't vote does not mean that they are not your constituents. And Councilwoman Suara and I aren't the council members for immigrants. We all are. You know, we all have constituents who are undocumented, and it could mean that they can be persecuted. And I do not put it as outside the realm of possibility, because earlier this year, I had people calling me, telling me that ICE was hanging around our courtroom waiting on people. If this can make it easier for them to do their job, they will use it, and they will request warrants. You know, we also run the possibility of expanding more surveillance. and to quote, you know, a Sam Seaborn, it's not just about LPRs. It's about the next 20 years. In the 20s and 30s, it was the role of government. In the 50s and 60s, it was civil rights. The next 2 decades are going to be privacy. I'm talking about the internet. I'm talking about cell phones. I'm talking about health records and who's gay and who's not. And moreover, in a country born on the will to be free, what could be more fundamental than this? You know, this is a slippery slope. And I want you all to understand that, because my generation and your children's generation is going to be dealing with this for a long time. Because we are a generation that has grown up in only the internet. And that's all we're on. We have been exposed to surveillance in ways that my parents never were, and you all might never have been. This is important, and I'm sorry to be so passionate about it, but it frustrates me that we're talking about this. It frustrates me that we are talking about surveilling our communities when MMPD is already doing work that seems to be working, right? This whole issue came up because of drag racing. I sent an email to my constituents that had images of that MMPD posted of drag racers that were caught. There are better ways to do this, and I just do not think that this is the way. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and I so appreciate your passionate plea in your remarks, and that is something that we do need to consider as we continue to have this discussion. So thank you so much. Council Member Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate all this conversation is so important, and appreciate Council Members O'Connell and Rosenberg for bringing this issue up in the first place, and then being willing to stop and have a community discussion, which I think is important, not because we are deliberately expanding, but because our current law doesn't provide any guidelines. And right now, our current law doesn't deal with these being located on private property. And Councilmember Rosenberg has said that they're already allowed in mobile situations, and I'm not sure how that fits with our current law, but I think it is important for us to continue to put the guidelines in place and the safeguards that we've talked about. As Ms. Johnson said, you know, it's so important to have the policy ahead of time, and that's exactly what we're doing. There is no money for us to buy cameras. That's not what we're doing. We are saying if these exist, we need to get ahead of the technology and put our arms around the rules, and I think that's really important. So I would like to ask if, as we continue these community conversations, we also have the possibility of a council workshop where we could look at the parts of Councilmember Rosenberg's amendment, which there are some excellent things in there, and if there's a way to work with the important work that Councilmember Johnston and O'Connell and Nash have done on that version. And rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater and stop, I think we're not complete if we just don't do anything. That we can do good work, and I would ask if you could set up a workshop before these bills come back before us so we can openly talk specifically about the legislation.
Thank you, and I think that is very much a possibility and something that we should do. I guess at this point, I'm really wanting to focus on involving the public, having the public input and participation in this. I think that's part of the problem that we've had in the past, is that we make policies without a lot of public input and participation. And I want to make sure that we do that. But I do agree with you that we do, in addition to that, need to have a workshop or something where the council members can come together and discuss the two bills, maybe see how we can condense them into one, or have some other all-encompassing policy and legislation to address this issue if it is in fact something that we as a council decide that we need to move forward with. So thank you so much, Councilmember Allen. Ms. Fetchard, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate this. And I appreciate you having this meeting because I think this conversation is necessary, it's important, and it's timely. My question, I think, would go to either Dr. Daniel or even Mr. Tucker. I know that there's been discussion regarding the misuse of LPRs across the country, but I'm interested in knowing if anyone has done research of the misuse of LPRs by law enforcement in our surrounding counties and across our state. I've had some interaction with people who have had some complaints regarding this. And I just want to know, as we are looking at what's happening across this nation, I think that we need to be concerned about what's happening in our own backyards. And so if there has been research regarding LPRs that are in cities in the state of Tennessee, do they have any information regarding that?
Thank you. Dr. Daniel or Mr. Tucker?
I'm happy to go first and then give it up. I'm not aware of studies in Tennessee specifically. So what I've surveyed, and I'll send this out, there's about almost about 10 documents ranging from going from 2007 to about 2016, surveyed transportation uses and privacy risks, all the way to community surveys, as well as largely from the law perspective, especially the Fourth Amendment, but to some degree the First Amendment as well. And like I mentioned before, the legal perspective in the law is not caught up to technological advances. Some people believe that legislation is the way to govern this, and some people believe that the courts are better to handle it than passing legislation. One opinion says that by doing this, by having public input, you might overcompensate and counterintuitively disenfranchise people who are most likely to be targeted, which in this document I mentioned before was they found to be the Muslim community. But specifically to your question, for Tennessee and the surrounding communities, I'm not aware of those.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tucker, are you aware of any incidences in Tennessee specifically?
As it pertains to surveillance being abused and misused?
Yes.
Yeah, the quick answer is absolutely. The ACLU of Tennessee went to court in Memphis for violation of a consent decree that was put in place in the late 70s to govern political surveillance. And we found that law enforcement was utilizing social media, fake accounts, a blacklist or a block list of individuals to monitor when they appeared at the city council. And so, I think the quick response is when there is a tool and when the uses are not, when there's not specificity around the use of the tool and the policies that govern the use, then there is potential for abuse. And the court agreed with us in finding that Memphis Police Department violated a 1978 consent decree in their use of surveillance technology, and they are now under a court monitor to ensure that there's compliance and that policies are put in place to prevent future abuse of surveillance technology.
Thank you. Councilman Nash? You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Tucker, in relation to the Memphis case, was it specific to LPRs?
What we found, and I would feel much more comfortable if our legal director, Tom Costelli, could speak to all of the tools that were utilized. And so I'm not going to get and misspeak, but there is a potential that it did not involve LPRs, but just involve surveillance technology. But I don't want to misspeak and speak incorrectly, sir.
Thank you. I understand. To kind of speak with in relation to Council Member Allen's, I know the Bill 2020-582 by Johnston doesn't establish a single LPR program. She has worked very hard and met with ACLU and other folks to try and understand what kind of policy you would want. And the LPR policy, not just to law enforcement use. For instance, we all know that Public Works is interested in possibly using license plate readers for parking enforcement, which is done. I know I've been to Maine and down in Florida, and a couple of days later, after I get home, I get this note that I owe them $5 because I was on the turnpike, and a license plate reader billed me for that. So we're not just talking about law enforcement use, but I want to assure, at least for my part, that any LPR bill we pass will certainly involve all of the things about the length of storage, the limited uses, who has access, and where it's placed. I think those are all extremely important issues, but I don't think we've oversold the benefits, though. I mean, when you speak to Brentwood Police Department, when you speak to Belmead Police Department, they have recovered many stolen cars, and I don't see the number of cameras going up. Belmead's small enough that they've been able to kind of place the cameras around their city, so they kind of have some idea who's coming in, and that's a real deterrent. If people are going to burglarize cars and are passing through there, they know there's a good chance they're going to be running by somebody's camera. Nashville being as large as it is, that's never going to happen. That we would do that, but again, we're very interested in making sure that we make and address all the issues that have been raised here. I think it's possible to do, and we can move forward. And again, before any program was coming, those programs would have to come back before the council to make sure that if the police department wants to start using them in a number of police cars, all right, what is your policy? Who has access? How often do we audit this thing? And all of those things will be addressed on a case-by-case basis. If Public Works wants, all right, how long are you keeping the data on parking and the like? Those are all things that will come back to council for us to assess before we approve such a program. The bill before you now does not approve any program. It just kind of enables folks to go forward and come back to us.
Thank you, Councilman. We have about 5 more minutes before our cutoff here, and I do see another hand. We need to move Councilman O'Connell up to panelists so that he can ask his question. I'm not sure. Can you speak, Councilman O'Connell? Yeah, we need to move him up to the panelist. I'll just, while they're doing that, I just want to kind of recap what we've been hearing as far as concerns regarding LPRs, the access to data, how the data will be shared, how long the data will be stored, and needing safeguards and accountability measures to lower the risk of misuse are some of the key points that I'm hearing in this discussion today. Councilman O'Connell, are you live now?
I am. Thank you, Madam
Okay.
Chair. And I just do want to respond to something Councilmember Nash mentioned. I think this is why it's so good to be having public conversation about this. I will say, for my part, based on what we already know from 2 different sets of data about traffic stops, and to something Mr. Tucker said earlier about civil liberties and policing in particularly communities of color in Nashville, I can imagine there are thousands of Nashvillians, and frankly, even as somebody who is not in a minority community, I would count myself in this number, who do not want to just have it be known that they are going into Belmead for reasons specifically related to traffic stop data, right? Or other reasons, right? We as a free citizenry should not expect that effectively a state supervised surveillance network is going to be creating new walls, divisions, and barriers within our community based on who is entering that community. I understand that the deterrent effect that Commander Nash speaks to, but I will say, I think the chilling effect on free movement is actually far greater concern and absolutely limits the upside of the ability to locate people after the fact. I think there are other techniques in policing and frankly even in technology that can be used that are not nearly so chilling in terms of people's free movement about their city without being surveilled. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman O'Connell. And I think there seems to be, I keep hearing two different viewpoints as it relates to how the LPRs work in regards to surveillance and actual data storage. And so I just want to make it clear, and maybe Dr. Daniel, if you could speak to this specifically as someone who has studied license plate readers quite extensively, the idea that they would be used for surveillance. Are you aware of, in your research, any cases where the LPRs were used or scanners were used for surveilling? I mean, active live footage, camera footage of events happening in the public right of way?
Yeah, good question. And a lot of the literature is things like has mass surveillance in the title. But most of the court cases have revolved around just the storage and the long-term storage and use of specific location data, and not live video feeds, for instance. I think there was a court case in 2014 where it came up before the Supreme Court where I wish Professor Slobodin was on the call, he could correct me as a lawyer. But what they found was that individual license plate snapshots, ALPR snapshots, were not a search, but the long-term retention and use over a wide geographic range could infringe on Fourth Amendment rights. And so that's the main court decision seemed to have been revolve around the Fourth Amendment and a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that when you have a lot of location points over a long period of time, then you can recreate someone's precise actions and track them and figure out what they were doing, where they were going, and that's a concern.
And Madam Chair, to be clear about Belmead's use case in particular, because this did come up extensively when council considered this back in 2017, those are just cameras. If you are riding your bicycle, if you are in a convertible, if your windows are not tinted, if you make a rude gesture at those cameras, that will be picked up on those Belmead cameras for anybody going into or traveling through Belmead where those cameras are. They are not restricted to just only capturing license plate data.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, I went to Belmead Police Department and looked at what was on their data. And Councilman O'Connell, I did not see any bicycles. It was all the rear ends of a car. And I just to address your issue about kind of being surveilled if you're going to Belmead, Belmead Police Department will never know you went through there unless, I don't know what kind of car you drive. I'm going to say you drive a red pickup, unless there's a red pickup that got seen breaking into a car or a home. And then in which case, at a certain time, they can go back and review the footage, and maybe they find that red pickup. And that's the only reason they're going to be interested in whether Councilman O'Connell was in Belmead.
That might be. That depends on that's a great scenario. That's given the current state of the policy and the individual officers who are there. If you got bad actors who passed an even worse policy provision, or even who had access to the data, they could just say, "Hey, did you happen to see anybody who had a red pickup?" And suddenly that becomes the search that Daniel was talking about.
And if I may, also, I could go sit outside, go by your house, grab your license plate number, and then file an open records request on that from Belmead for however long they retain the data, know every time and everywhere you traveled in Belmead.
And that's another good point as far as the policies that would be put in place, because no one should be able to just write down a license plate number and go and ask for a records request without a legitimate crime police report. And there are laws to safeguard around people making false claims. So I mean, all of these scenarios that you all are mentioning are definitely cases that could happen, and things that should be considered as we are looking at the legislation and considering policies and procedures that could be put in place to address those safeguards and accountability measures if there are misuse, accountability measures that would be implemented to address that misuse. Mr. Tucker.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Daniel spoke to it as well, but the idea that, potentially a snapshot does not represent surveillance, but he spoke to exactly what I was going to speak to, which is the accumulation of dozens or hundreds of snapshots turn into a pretty accurate picture of your movement and the places that you frequent, and that information in the wrong hands can represent surveillance, does represent a pretty accurate picture of your interests, your religion, your medical needs, what have you. So it's not so much that it captures a photo, but it captures your photo wherever that technology is. And you could pretty much come up with a pretty accurate piecing of the puzzle if that data is retained for long periods of time. And that is surveillance.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. In your just a follow up, Mr. Tucker, in looking at that data collection as surveillance, is it a case of just the data collection in itself being classified as surveillance, or is it someone using that data? Because if there were policies where the data that would not be stored for more than 30 days or a limited amount of time, would you consider that as continued surveillance?
It's the data retention. And so if there is 60 days or 30 days, what have you, and let's say we move away from instantaneous purging of the records and to track where Brandon has frequented for the last however many days it is. Just wanting to move the conversation away from it's just a single snapshot. That's not what we're in. I believe Daniel actually spoke to the instance of the mayor, I guess in Minneapolis or where, I forget exactly which state it was, but his movements were tracked upwards of 40, some odd times. And so to be able to piece together an accurate depiction of someone's movement, and again, to echo and to agree with Councilman O'Connell, it can have a chilling effect on individuals knowing that record is being compounded, accumulated, and tracking an individual's travels and being retained for an extended period of time. I think that gives law enforcement or anyone who has access to that record a pretty clear and precise picture.
Thank you.
Councilman Rosenberg's point, Madam Chair, I'm sorry.
No, I was coming to you next anyway. Your hand is up.
Thank you. Sorry. The thing I was going to say there is I'm pretty sure Councilman Rosenberg probably knows whether, or Mr. Tucker as well, I believe it is state law that currently establishes that these are public records. And so this is not a thing that I believe we have jurisdiction to alter locally.
Mhm. I know that General Funk or even Assistant General Jenny Charles are on the line. Can you all speak to that?
I believe that's correct, because it's the way the statute's written, everything is public record, and then they make certain exceptions for what's not public record. So from my last review of that law, I believe Councilman McConnell is correct on that.
Thank you. And I saw Mr. Cooper, I saw your mic come alive. Did you want to add to that?
Yes, I was just going to say that I looked as recently as today, and there are 550 exceptions to the Public Records Act, and license plate reader data is not one of them. So it would take a state law to make that confidential. It is confidential in some other states, but not Tennessee.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you. Just to speak to that, because it's correct. I mean, we have established that it is subject to open records. One thing that I have done in my legislation, as far as the surveillance piece of it, the original was 30 days of retention. And I just emailed John Cooper to ask him to make an amendment to reduce that to 15 days to further restrict that retention. But also I'm working with some state legislators to close that or to pull LPR data out of the open records request. And that's something that they've done. Obviously, there's, Mr. Cooper said there was like 500 and something different exceptions to the public records. And so it's been done, it's easy to do, and they were very, very open to it. So I feel pretty confident that that's something that, you know, it makes sense, number one. And that, so I feel pretty confident that we will get that done, but that is in the works. The other thing that I will say is that I've asked other municipalities that are using this technology that have these databases, and they have not had an issue where people are making these public records requests for this data. So it hasn't presented itself. It could, so I'd like to head it off.
Thank you for that clarification and an update regarding your legislation. Mr. Tucker, your hand is still raised. Do you have another comment? Okay. So I guess just to wrap up now, because we are 2 minutes before 6:30, I appreciate everyone joining us today. I appreciate our panelists giving us the perspectives from the prosecution and defendants and legal and also civil rights perspective. This is, like I said earlier, the second meeting of a series of 3 that have been scheduled. The next meeting is scheduled for January 12th, and it will, at that meeting, we'll have Dr. Daniel again kind of give us an update and recap on what we've discussed in the previous meetings. Also, Melody Fowler Green with the Human Rights Commission, Jim Hawk with Neighbor to Neighbor, and we'll also have 2 community members that will provide input and feedback regarding license plate readers as it relates to the communities that they come from. So we'll have more information about that coming forward in a couple of days. And with that, if there are no more questions or comments, we will adjourn the meeting for today. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, everybody on the call.
Thank you. Good discussion.
Thank you. Good night.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.